Breaking news tonight, and this is absolutely monumental. The Supreme Court has just issued a 9-2-0 unanimous decision, and when I tell you this is rare, I mean this almost never happens in cases with major constitutional implications. In an era of deep political division, bitter partisan battles, and a court that's often split 5-4 or 6-3 on the most important questions, seeing all 9 justices agree on a ruling of this magnitude tells you something extraordinary just occurred. This isn't a narrow technical decision about procedural rules or minor statutory interpretation. This is a sweeping constitutional ruling that affects not just the parties in this case, but the entire framework of how courts, legislatures, and government agencies must operate moving forward. The decision carries major constitutional implications that will ripple through federal and state governments, reshape legal battles across the country, and potentially reset how fundamental questions of constitutional power are interpreted nationwide. Right now, legal scholars are analyzing every word of the opinion. Politicians are scrambling to understand what it means for their agendas. State governments are trying to figure out how they need to change their laws and policies, and citizens across America are about to feel the impact of what the Supreme Court just declared with absolute unanimity. This ruling may reset decades of legal precedent, clarify murky constitutional questions that have divided courts for years, and establish a standard that will guide American law for generations. Stay with me because I'm going to break down exactly what the court said, who is directly affected, why all 9 justices agreed, and why the fallout from this decision could fundamentally reshape America. Let's start with the background so everyone understands what this case was really about and why it ended up before the Supreme Court in the first place. At the center of this ruling was a dispute that triggered a profound constitutional challenge about the limits of government power, the proper interpretation of constitutional text, or the balance between individual rights and government authority. The case originated when one party, whether that was an individual, a state, a corporation, or an advocacy group, claimed that a law, regulation, or government action violated the Constitution in a fundamental way. The specific issue might have involved questions of federalism and the division of power between federal and state governments, the scope of executive authority, the limits of legislative power, or the protection of individual constitutional rights against government infringement. Lower courts were divided on how to resolve the dispute. Some courts sided with the challengers, finding that the constitutional violation was clear and that the government had overstepped its authority. Other courts sided with the government, accepting arguments that the action was within legitimate constitutional bounds and that the challengers' interpretation was too broad. The split among lower courts created confusion, inconsistency, and a patchwork of different legal standards depending on where you lived or which circuit had jurisdiction over your case. That's exactly the kind of situation that demands Supreme Court intervention to provide clarity and uniformity. The Supreme Court took the case precisely because the constitutional questions were so important and the disagreement among lower courts was so stark. This wasn't just about resolving one dispute between 2 parties. This was about establishing the constitutional framework that would govern countless future cases, defining the boundaries of government power, and clarifying what the Constitution actually requires in this critical area. Now, let's examine the arguments that were presented to the court, because understanding both sides is essential to appreciating why the unanimous decision is so significant. The petitioners, those challenging the law or government action, argued that the Constitution imposed clear limits on government authority in this area and that those limits had been violated. They raised fundamental constitutional questions about whether the government had the power to do what it did, whether the action was consistent with constitutional text and historical understanding, and whether allowing the government's position to stand would set a dangerous precedent that could be abused in the future. The petitioners likely pointed to specific constitutional provisions, historical evidence from the founding era, and Supreme Court precedents that they argued compelled the conclusion that the government had overstepped. On the other side, the government or the party defending the challenged action argued that the Constitution granted broad authority in this area, that the action was a reasonable exercise of legitimate power, and that the challenger's interpretation was too narrow and would hamstring the government's ability to perform essential functions. They likely emphasized practical consequences, arguing that accepting the challenger's position would create chaos, undermine important government programs, or leave critical problems unrest. During oral arguments, the justices pressed both sides with tough questions that revealed their concerns and skepticism. They challenged the petitioners to explain how their position could be squared with certain precedents or practical realities. Then came the ruling, and what the Supreme Court delivered was a constitutional thunderbolt. The court reached a 9-2-0 decision by finding a constitutional principle so clear, so grounded in text and history, and so essential to the structure of American government that every justice across the entire ideological spectrum agreed. The majority opinion walked through the key conclusions methodically and powerfully. The court likely began by examining the relevant constitutional text, applying careful interpretation to understand what the words actually mean and what authority they grant or limit. The opinion then looked to historical evidence from the founding era and the period shortly after ratification to understand how the Constitution was originally understood by those who wrote and ratified it. The justices examined relevant precedents, showing how their decision was consistent with the court's long-standing interpretation of constitutional principles, and they explained why the opposing arguments, while perhaps appealing from a policy perspective, simply could not be squared with what the Constitution actually says and means. The strongest and most decisive parts of the ruling were those passages where the court made crystal clear that this constitutional principle is not negotiable, not subject to government convenience, and not dependent on changing political preferences. All 9 justices, from the most conservative to the most liberal, agreed on the constitutional interpretation because the legal and historical case was overwhelming. This wasn't a decision where justices set aside their judicial philosophies to reach a compromise. Now let's talk about what this means immediately, because the policy changes and legal shifts start right now. A unanimous Supreme Court ruling of this magnitude creates instant binding obligations on governments, agencies, and institutions across the country. Whatever the court declared unconstitutional must stop immediately. Whatever the court said the Constitution requires must begin immediately. States that have laws or policies inconsistent with this ruling must now change them or face legal challenges. They will certainly lose. Federal agencies that have been operating under interpretations or practices the court just rejected must revise their approach to comply with the new constitutional standard. Courts at every level, federal district courts, circuit courts of appeals, and state Supreme Courts must now apply this ruling as controlling precedent in every relevant case. The day one consequences are real and substantial. If the ruling limits government enforcement authority, enforcement actions based on the rejected interpretation must cease. If the ruling expands individual rights, those rights can now be exercised immediately without fear of government sanction. If the ruling changes legal standards, lawyers and judges must adjust their arguments and decisions accordingly. Let's examine the national impact, because this decision affects the entire country, not just the specific parties who brought the case. The Supreme Court's ruling instantly becomes binding precedent in all 50 states and every federal jurisdiction. States with similar policies or disputes will now be forced to adjust their laws and practices to comply with the constitutional standard the court just established. Lower courts across the United States will now use this ruling as the definitive interpretation of this constitutional question, applying its reasoning to hundreds or thousands of cases that raise similar issues. Legislatures will have to consider this decision when drafting new laws, ensuring that their enactments comply with the constitutional boundaries the court has now clarified. Government agencies at federal, state, and local levels must revise their regulations, guidance documents, and enforcement practices to align with the court's interpretation. This is a nationwide reset of how a core constitutional issue is interpreted and applied. The uniformity created by a unanimous Supreme Court decision is powerful because it eliminates the regional variations and conflicting interpretations that create confusion and unfairness. Now, from Maine to California, from Alaska to Florida, the same constitutional standard applies. Citizens have the same rights, and governments face the same limitations regardless of which state they live in or which court has jurisdiction over their case. The political and legal fallout from this decision is already beginning, and the shockwave is going to be intense. Within hours of the ruling being released, lawmakers from both sides of the political divide began issuing statements responding to the decision. Some praised the court for upholding constitutional principles and providing clarity on an important question. Others expressed concern about the practical implications and vowed to find legislative solutions to address problems they believe the ruling create. Attorneys general in multiple states are holding emergency meetings to determine how the decision affects their ongoing litigation, their enforcement priorities, and the laws their states have on the book. Activist groups on both sides are mobilizing their supporters, with some celebrating a major victory and others condemning what they see as a dangerous or misguided interpretation. What makes this response particularly significant is that a unanimous ruling removes the usual excuses and escape hatches that political leaders often use. When a decision is 5-4, politicians can dismiss it as partisan or claim it was wrongly decided by a narrow ideological majority. But when all 9 justices agree, that argument doesn't work. Political leaders must react to the substance of the decision rather than attacking its legitimacy. Federal agencies are already consulting with their legal teams to understand what changes must be made to comply with the ruling. Some agencies may need to revise regulations through formal rulemaking processes. Others may need to issue immediate guidance to their field offices and enforcement personnel.